In the late autumn of 1944, a convoy of canvas-topped American trucks carried its cargo of German women prisoners through the stark, rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The world outside the grimy canvas flap was a study in brown and gray. Skeletal fingers of oak and maple clawed at a sky the color of dishwater, and the fields, stripped of their harvest, lay dormant under a thin, hard frost. Inside the truck bed, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, damp wool, and the unspoken fear that had been their constant companion since the surrender in Normandy. They were packed shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches, their bodies swaying and jolting in unison with the vehicle's rough passage over the uneven country roads. No one spoke. The rumble of the engine and the rhythmic slap of the tires against the asphalt were the only sounds. Hannah, who had once tracked radio signals in the relative quiet of a concrete bunker, now tracked the expressions of the women around her. She saw Liesel, barely 20, her face a pale, taut mask of defiant belief. Liesel's lips moved silently, perhaps reciting the slogans they had all been taught, the warnings about the barbarians from the West, the depraved Americans who would inflict unimaginable cruelties. Across from her sat Marta, a former nurse's aide whose hands, now resting in her lap, had once been deft and sure. Marta's eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in a willed retreat from the present moment. Her face was a landscape of weary resignation, her surrender more complete, more profound than any flag lowered over a ruined city. Hannah felt herself suspended between them, between Liesel's rigid terror and Marta's exhausted acceptance. She herself felt only a cold, hollow watchfulness. Her fear was a distant hum, a signal from a station too far away to be read clearly, drowned out by the static of sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. For hours, the landscape repeated itself. Bare woods, fallow fields, the occasional farmhouse with a plume of smoke rising from its chimney, a brief, alien glimpse of a life that continued, indifferent to their passage. The guards, 2 young American soldiers in the cab, were invisible to them, their presence felt only in the steady, controlled speed of the truck. They were not being driven with manic cruelty, nor with casual neglect. They were being transported, like material, with a dispassionate efficiency that was, in its own way, more unnerving than overt hostility. Hostility could be understood. It fit the narrative they had been fed for years. This methodical calm did not. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, the convoy slowed. Hannah leaned closer to a tear in the canvas. Through it, she saw a high fence of wire mesh, topped with tight spools of barbed wire that glinted like thorns in the fading light. Wooden watchtowers stood sentinel at the corners, stark silhouettes against the bruised purple sky. A sign, painted in simple black letters on a white board, read, Camp Swiftwater. This was it, the place from the whispers and the propaganda posters. The truck rumbled through a wide gate, which was pulled shut behind them by guards whose movements were practiced and economical. The vehicle came to a halt in a wide, gravel-strewn yard surrounded by long, identical wooden barracks, their windows dark and vacant. The engine cut out, and in the sudden, profound silence, the cold seemed to intensify, seeping through the floorboards and the thin fabric of their coats. For a long moment, nothing happened. The women remained frozen on their benches, a tableau of apprehension. Then, the canvas flap at the back of the truck was unfastened and thrown aside, flooding the interior with the harsh, pale light of the yard. A sergeant stood there, his face shadowed by the brim of his helmet. He was not a monster. He was a man, older than the guards in the cab, with a tired set to his jaw. He did not shout. He did not brandish a weapon. He simply pointed to the ground and spoke a single, incomprehensible English word. The meaning, however, was clear. Get out. One by one, they slid off the benches and dropped to the gravel, their legs stiff and unsteady. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and cold earth, a stark contrast to the stale confines of the truck. They were herded into a ragged line, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Hannah looked at the barracks, the wire, the impassive faces of the half-dozen American soldiers who watched them. There was no jeering, no taunts, no leering eyes. There was only a quiet, procedural order. This, Hannah thought, was the most terrifying thing of all. It was a cruelty she had not been prepared for, the cruelty of a system, impersonal and absolute, that would process them not as enemies to be hated, but as objects to be managed. The gate had closed, and the world they knew had vanished behind it. They were numbers now, items on a manifest, standing in the heart of a silence that felt heavier and more final than any bomb blast. The sergeant, whose name they would later learn was Davis, walked the length of their line. His gaze was clinical, assessing their condition with the disinterest of a stockman inspecting livestock. He conferred in low tones with another soldier holding a clipboard, then turned back to the women. He pointed toward a long, low building at the far end of the compound, its windows glowing with a flat, yellow light. He gestured for them to move, a simple, impatient flick of his wrist. There were no dogs, no whips, just the quiet authority of his posture and the collective understanding that disobedience was futile. As they began to march, their worn shoes crunching on the gravel, Hannah felt a tremor of the old fear return. The methodical calm was breaking. The processing was about to begin. They were walking toward the light, but every instinct, honed by years of carefully constructed hatred, told her they were walking into the dark. They were led into the processing building, and the heavy wooden door shut behind them with a solid, definitive thud. The air inside was immediately different, warm, humid, and thick with the acrid, cleansing smells of lye, carbolic soap, and disinfectant. It was the smell of a hospital or a mortuary. The room was large and bare, with concrete floors and unpainted wooden walls. A handful of American women in plain, functional uniforms stood waiting for them, their faces impassive. One of them, older, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stepped forward. She was a nurse. Hannah could tell by the way she stood, by the crispness of her white apron. She spoke in clear, slow German, her accent thick but her words unmistakable. "You will leave your clothes on the benches. Everything. You will then proceed to the showers. There will be no talking." A wave of cold dread washed over the prisoners. This was the moment they had been warned about, the ritual humiliation, the stripping away of the final vestiges of their identity. Liesel's face hardened, her chin lifting in a gesture of doomed defiance. She crossed her arms over her chest, her body rigid. The nurse's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met Liesel's for a moment. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, weary patience. "It is for hygiene," she said, her voice flat, "for the health of the camp, and for your own. Do as you are told." The authority in her voice was absolute, backed not by the threat of violence, but by an unassailable sense of purpose. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to undress. Hands fumbled with buttons and ties, the rustle of clothing a soft, mournful sound in the quiet room. Each layer removed felt like a surrender, a peeling away of the self. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the small pile of her own worn garments grow. Her uniform, the fabric that had defined her for years, lay in a heap, suddenly just a collection of tired, gray cloth. The vulnerability was absolute. They stood, naked and shivering, under the harsh glare of the bare electric bulbs, a gathering of pale bodies marked by the hardships of war, thin limbs, bruised skin, the faint tracery of scars. But the expected jeers and inspections did not come. The American women worked with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. They were directed toward an adjoining room, a large tiled chamber lined with shower heads. A guard turned a large wheel on the wall, and with a groan of old pipes, water began to spray from the nozzles. Hannah flinched, expecting it to be icy cold, another casual cruelty. Instead, a wave of steam billowed through the room, and the water that hit her skin was blessedly, shockingly hot. A collective gasp went through the women, a sound of pure, involuntary relief. The heat was a physical absolution, melting the deep, settled chill from their bones. The steam filled the room, swirling in thick clouds that obscured the figures around them, granting a temporary, welcome anonymity. For a few minutes, they were not prisoners, not a collective entity, but simply individuals under a stream of hot water. The soap, a coarse, unscented bar, lathering in their hands, washing away weeks of grime and fear. After the showers, they were given rough, clean towels and led one by one into a smaller room for a medical check. The nurse who had spoken to them, Nurse Eleanor, according to the name stitched on her uniform, conducted the examinations herself. Her touch was clinical, her movements practiced and sure. She checked their hair for lice, their skin for rashes, their throats for infection. Her expression never changed. She was not kind, but she was not unkind. She was a professional performing a necessary task. When she examined Hannah, she paused, her fingers gently probing a long, faded scar on Hannah's forearm. Hannah tensed, but the nurse simply made a note on her clipboard and moved on. The examination was over in minutes. It was thorough, but it was not degrading. It was a procedure devoid of malice. Finally, they were directed to a third room, where stacks of folded clothing lay on long tables. They were not their own clothes, but they were not prison stripes. They were simple, dark gray cotton dresses, thick woolen stockings, and sturdy, functional shoes. Underneath, long-sleeved undershirts and drawers made of clean, soft flannel. And for the outside, a heavy, dark blue wool coat. Hannah pulled the dress over her head. The fabric was coarse but clean, smelling faintly of the lye soap from the laundry. The fit was approximate, but it was whole and mended. The coat was heavy, its warmth immediate. Dressed in these anonymous garments, they looked like members of some obscure, sober religious sect. They had been stripped of their uniforms, but they had been given something else in return. A new skin, one that offered not identity, but warmth and a strange, unsettling form of dignity. As they were led out of the processing building and toward the barracks that would be their new home, the cold night air felt less hostile. The steam from the showers still clung to their hair, and the clean linen against their skin was a quiet, powerful testament to a reality that was beginning to diverge, sharply and unervingly, from the one they had been promised. The restoration had been a form of discipline, a moral reset administered through soap and steam. The barracks assigned to them was identical to the others. A long, rectangular wooden structure with a single door at one end and a row of small, square windows along each side. Inside, the cavernous space was filled with two neat rows of metal-framed bunk beds, each with a thin mattress, a single pillow, and two gray wool blankets folded with geometric precision at its foot. A pot-bellied stove stood in the center of the room, its metal chimney rising through the ceiling. It was unlit, and the air was bitingly cold, but the space was clean, the wooden floor swept bare. There was an orderliness to the place that was both stark and reassuring. Hannah chose a lower bunk near the back, placing her new coat carefully on the mattress. The women moved with a quiet, subdued efficiency, claiming beds and settling in, the silence broken only by the creak of bed frames and the soft rustle of their new clothes. They did not have to wait long. Within the hour, a loud bell clanged somewhere in the compound, a sharp, metallic sound that made them all jump. A young guard appeared at the doorway, rifle held loosely at his side. He didn't enter but gestured them out with his head. "Mess hall," he said. The English words foreign but the meaning clear from his gesture toward a larger building from which light and a faint aroma were now emanating. They filed out into the freezing darkness and marched in a loose column across the gravel yard. The smell grew stronger as they approached, the unmistakable, savory scent of cooking meat and vegetables. It was a smell from another lifetime, a memory of home and hearth that seemed grotesquely out of place behind barbed wire. The mess hall was a vast, noisy space, brightly lit and filled with the same long trestle tables and benches as the barracks. The clatter of metal trays and the low hum of conversation from the American soldiers already eating at the far end of the hall filled the air. The women were directed to a serving line, where two prisoners from another barracks, men in drab work clothes, ladled food from enormous steel pots onto metal trays. The steam rising from the pots was thick with the scent of a rich stew. Hannah held out her tray, and a man with a tired, expressionless face slopped a heavy ladleful of the mixture onto it. It was thick with chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions, swimming in a dark, savory gravy. Further down the line, another server placed a thick slice of dark bread next to the stew and filled a heavy ceramic mug with a steaming, dark liquid that smelled faintly of roasted barley. A coffee substitute, but a hot one. Hannah carried her tray to an empty table, her hands trembling slightly. It was more food than she had seen in one place in months. She sat down, Marta on one side, Liesel on the other. For a moment, they all just stared at their trays. The propaganda films had shown skeletal prisoners being tormented with scraps of moldy bread. The radio broadcasts had spoken of deliberate starvation, of Americans who would let them waste away from hunger. This tray, heavy and warm in her hands, was a powerful, irrefutable contradiction. Liesel picked up her spoon but didn't eat. She stared at the stew as if it were poison. "It's a trick," she whispered, her voice tight with a desperate need to believe it. "They are fattening us. For interrogation. For work. For something terrible." Marta ignored her. She picked up the bread, broke off a piece, and began to eat with slow, deliberate bites. Her eyes closed for a second in something that looked like prayer. Hannah watched the line. After the last of the women had been served, the American guards, Sergeant Davis among them, got in the same line. They held the same metal trays. The same tired-looking prisoners served them from the very same steel pots. They received the same portion of stew, the same slice of bread, the same mug of ersatz coffee. Then they went and sat at their own tables and began to eat. The sight was profoundly disorienting. There was no special fare for the captors, no privileged meal served behind a screen. They were eating the prisoners' food. Or rather, the prisoners were eating their food. The hierarchy of captor and captive, which should have been absolute, dissolved in the steam rising from the stew. Hannah picked up her spoon. The stew was hot and nourishing. The beef was real, the vegetables soft. It was simple, unrefined camp food, but it was honest. It was fuel. The bread was dense and slightly sour, but it was filling. The warmth spread from her stomach through her entire body. A slow, creeping tide of physical well-being that was at war with the psychological conditioning of the past 6 years. She ate every last bite, using the bread to wipe the gravy from the bottom of her tray, just as she saw Sergeant Davis doing at his table across the hall. The shared gesture, this small, common act of ensuring no food was wasted, was more powerful than any speech. It was an unspoken statement of a shared, basic reality. Liesel eventually ate, too, her movements stiff and angry, as if the act of nourishing her own body was a form of betrayal. Hannah simply watched and ate, the warmth of the bread in her cold hands a tangible piece of evidence she could not ignore. The days at Camp Swiftwater settled into a rhythm dictated by bells and the rising and setting of a pale, indifferent sun. The routine was the true commander of the camp, a force more absolute than any officer. It began before dawn, with the jarring clang of the morning bell that sliced through the cold, dark air of the barracks. The first moments of consciousness were a blur of shivering limbs and the low groans of women rousing themselves from shallow sleep. The first task was always the bed. The 2 gray blankets had to be folded into a perfect, sharp-edged rectangle and placed, along with the pillow, at the head of the tautly pulled bottom sheet. It was a military ritual, a small daily imposition of order on the chaos of their lives. Sergeant Davis would often conduct the inspection himself, walking slowly down the aisle between the bunks, his eyes scanning for any imperfection. A sloppy fold would earn a sharp tap on the bed frame and a gesture to do it again. There was no shouting, just the quiet insistence on precision. After the inspection came roll call. They would stand in formation in the gravel yard, the frost crunching under their boots, as the sky slowly lightened from black to a bruised gray. An officer would call out their numbers, not their names, and they would respond with a clipped "ja." The cold was a physical presence, seeping into their bones, but the ritual was swift, another box to be ticked in the camp's daily ledger. From there, it was a march to the mess hall for a breakfast of thick, lumpy porridge and the same bitter coffee substitute. The meal was eaten quickly, in near silence. The women focused on getting the warm food inside them before the next bell rang, signaling the start of the workday. Hannah was assigned to the laundry. It was a huge, steamy building behind the mess hall, filled with enormous, rumbling washing machines and deep concrete sinks. Her work detail was responsible for the linen of the entire camp. The prisoners' clothes, the guards' uniforms, the sheets from the infirmary, the tablecloths from the officers' mess. The work was hard and monotonous. She spent hours standing over a sink, scrubbing heavily soiled clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. Other times, she helped load and unload the massive, churning washers, the heat from them a welcome respite from the cold. The air was perpetually thick with steam and the clean, harsh smell of lye soap. The constant noise of the machinery was a dull roar that made conversation impossible, isolating each woman in her own world of repetitive motion. Yet, there was a strange comfort in the work. The rhythm of it, scrub, rinse, wring, repeat, was meditative. It demanded physical effort but left her mind free to observe. She learned the intricate language of the building itself. The specific groan a machine made when it was overloaded, the sharp hiss of a leaking steam valve, the way the condensation drew fleeting patterns on the cold window panes. She worked alongside other women, their movements becoming synchronized over time, a silent ballet of shared labor. Sergeant Davis oversaw the laundry, but he rarely interfered. He would walk through the building once or twice a day, his presence a reminder of their status, but his primary concern was efficiency. As long as the quotas of clean, folded linen were met, he left them alone. The work was a form of moral order. Dirt was replaced with cleanliness, chaos with neatly folded stacks. Competence was the measure of a person's worth here, not their ideology or their former rank. Liesel had been assigned to the mending room, a quieter, brighter space where women sat with needles and thread, repairing torn uniforms and socks. Her small, precise stitches were filled with a cold fury. She saw the work as a form of collaboration, of aiding the enemy. Marta, with her nursing background, was given a position in the camp infirmary, assisting Nurse Eleanor. She moved through the small clinic with a restored sense of purpose, her hands once again busy with bandages and salves. The routine provided a structure that replaced the terrifying void left by their capture. It was a life devoid of freedom, but it was also, for the first time in a long while, a life devoid of the daily, imminent threat of violent death. The discipline of the camp was not meant to break their spirits. Hannah began to realize. It was meant to keep the camp functioning. They were cogs in a machine, but the machine was designed for maintenance, not destruction. Each folded sheet, each mended sock, each cleaned wound was a small act of defiance against the entropy of war. One evening, after the meager dinner, the routine was broken. Instead of being marched directly back to their barracks, they were told to remain in the mess hall. The tables were pushed back against the walls, and rows of benches were set up facing a blank, white wall. A wave of nervous murmuring went through the women. A political lecture? Re-education? Interrogations? The uncertainty was a cold knot in Hannah's stomach. Two young guards wheeled in a strange metal contraption on a cart and began to set it up at the back of the hall. It was a film projector. The guards worked with a kind of boyish enthusiasm, fumbling with reels of film and electrical cords. The prisoners watched them in baffled silence. Captain Miller, the camp commandant, a remote and rarely seen figure, stood at the front of the room. He was a tall, thin man with an academic air about him. He cleared his throat and spoke, another officer translating his English into clipped, formal German. Tonight, as a trial, we will show a motion picture. Your conduct will determine if this becomes a regular occurrence. He said nothing more, simply nodding to the guards at the back before taking a seat in the front row with his officers. The lights in the hall were extinguished, plunging them into a thick, expectant darkness. With a whir and a series of clicks, the projector shuddered to life. A bright, square beam of light shot out from the back of the room, cutting a perfect, luminous path through the dusty air. Hannah watched the motes of dust dance and swirl within the beam, tiny worlds illuminated for a fleeting moment. Then, images flickered onto the white wall. Black and white titles appeared, accompanied by a loud, brassy swell of music that was utterly foreign to their ears. It was an American musical comedy. For the first 20 minutes, The women sat in stiff, uncomprehending silence. The speed of the English dialogue was dizzying, the cultural references meaningless. The plot involved a case of mistaken identity, a fast-talking showgirl, and a bumbling millionaire. It was a world of impossible glamour and frivolous concerns, so far removed from their own reality that it felt like a broadcast from another planet. Hannah found herself studying not the film, but the faces of the other prisoners, their features softly illuminated by the reflected light from the screen. She saw bewilderment, suspicion, and a deep, ingrained resistance to this forced entertainment. Liesel sat ramrod straight, her arms crossed, her expression one of utter contempt for this decadent American foolishness. Then came a scene of pure physical comedy. The millionaire character, attempting to navigate a revolving door while carrying a stack of precariously balanced hatboxes, became hopelessly entangled. His frantic, flailing attempts to extricate himself were a masterpiece of choreographed slapstick. At first, there was only silence. Then, a single, suppressed giggle escaped from one of the younger women near the front. It was quickly stifled, but the sound had broken the spell. Another woman snorted, trying to turn it into a cough. Then a genuine laugh, loud and clear, erupted from somewhere in the middle of the room. It was followed by another, and another, until a wave of quiet, incredulous laughter rippled through the German prisoners. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound. Hannah felt a smile tug at her own lips, an involuntary physical response she couldn't suppress. She glanced at Liesel and saw, to her astonishment, the barest flicker of a smile on her face before she caught herself, her expression hardening once more into a scowl. But the moment had happened. In the shared darkness, surrounded by their captors, they had laughed at the same ridiculous spectacle. Hannah looked over at the guards standing along the walls. They weren't watching the prisoners for signs of subversion. They were watching the film, their faces relaxed, some of them grinning at the familiar scene. In that moment, the projector beam was more than just light. It was a bridge. It had spanned the vast gulf of language, politics, and war, and found a small, fragile point of common human experience. The simple, undeniable silliness of a man stuck in a revolving door. The shared laughter didn't change anything fundamental about their situation, but it subtly altered the emotional chemistry of the room. For a brief hour, they were not merely captors and captives. They were just people, sitting in the dark, watching the light dance on a wall. The flickering camaraderie of the film screening dissipated as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind a residue of confusion and debate. Back in the cold air of the barracks, huddled in their bunks under the dim glow of a few bare bulbs, the women dissected the evening's events in hushed, urgent whispers. The laughter had unsettled them, a breach in the discipline of hatred they had so carefully maintained. It was Liesel who gave voice to the resistance, her words a sharp, angry hiss in the quiet room. "You see how clever they are? It is poison, sweet poison. They show us their decadent films, they give us an extra piece of bread, and they expect us to forget who we are." She sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "It is a psychological tactic, designed to weaken our resolve, to make us soft. The guards who laughed at that foolish film are the same men who would shoot us without a second thought if we tried to run." Several of the younger women, who had been swept up in the simple pleasure of the movie, now looked ashamed, their brief joy curdling into suspicion. They nodded in agreement, their faces grim in the shadowy light. They needed to believe in the enemy's monolithic cruelty. It was the framework that held their world together. Any evidence to the contrary was a threat, a crack in the foundation of their identity. Marta, who had been methodically darning a sock, looked up from her work, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "And what resolve are we meant to be showing, child?" she asked, her voice low and devoid of emotion. "The war is over for us. Our resolve did not stop their tanks. Our resolve does not keep us warm at night. This blanket," she patted the coarse wool of her bunk, "keeps me warm. The stew fills my belly. These things are real. The rest is just noise." Her pragmatism was a bucket of cold water on Liesel's ideological fire. Marta was not interested in the grand narrative of the struggle. She was focused on the small, tangible facts of survival. "It is a betrayal to think that way," Liesel shot back, her voice rising. "A betrayal of our comrades, of our homeland, of everything we fought for." "We fought and we lost," Marta said flatly, returning to her sewing. "Now we endure. Looking for ghosts and plots in a bowl of soup is a luxury we cannot afford." Hannah had remained silent, listening. She lay on her side, facing the rough wooden wall of the barracks, her back to the others. She understood Liesel's fear. To accept the possibility that the enemy was not the monster she had been taught to expect was to accept that the entire world she had believed in was a lie. It was easier, safer, to see kindness as a trick and decency as a tactic. But Hannah was a signals operator by training. Her job had been to listen carefully, to filter out the noise and identify the true message. And what she was seeing and hearing at Camp Swiftwater was a signal that refused to align with the official broadcast. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear, not entering the argument but offering a piece of data. "This morning, I saw Sergeant Davis by the workshop," she said, still facing the wall. "He was working on a small wooden toy, a little horse on wheels. He was sanding it very carefully. He hit it when he saw me approaching." The room fell silent. The image was so mundane, so domestic, so profoundly at odds with the image of a brutal American guard. A man carving a toy for his son or daughter. It was a detail that fit nowhere in Liesel's worldview. "He probably confiscated it from a prisoner," Liesel scoffed, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The wood was new," Hannah replied simply. "I could smell the fresh shavings." She rolled over to face the room. Her eyes met Liesel's across the narrow aisle. "I am not saying they are our friends," she continued, her voice even. "I am not saying we should trust them. I am saying that what we were told and what we are seeing are two different things. And I do not know what to make of it." Her statement hung in the air, an admission of uncertainty that was more powerful than any argument. She wasn't offering a new belief system to replace the old one, only a quiet insistence on observing the facts on the ground. The debate ended, not with a resolution, but with a lingering, uncomfortable quiet. The seeds of doubt, planted by the hot shower, the shared meal, and the shared laughter, were beginning to sprout in the dark, confined space of the barracks. The enemy was refusing to behave as they were supposed to, and this failure of propaganda was more unsettling than any physical threat. It forced them to question not just their captors, but themselves. Once a month, they were permitted to write letters. The process, like everything else in the camp, was governed by a strict and orderly procedure. They were gathered in the mess hall after the morning meal, and each woman was given a single sheet of thin, regulation paper and a small, sharpened pencil. The rules were explained by the translator. The letter could not exceed 1 page, it must be written clearly, and it must not contain any information about the camp's location, troop movements, or any political statements. All letters would be read by a censor. Hannah sat at the long trestle table, the blank sheet of paper before her a small white desert. She stared at it, the pencil feeling heavy and useless in her fingers. What could she possibly write to her mother in Hamburg? The chasm between her reality and her mother's was too vast to be bridged by a few carefully chosen words. How could she describe this place? To write, "I am a prisoner in America," would be to invite despair. To write, "They are treating us well," felt like a profound betrayal of her country's suffering, a treasonous whisper. The truth itself had become a complex and dangerous thing. She looked around the room. Other women were bent over their papers, their faces tight with concentration. Some wrote furiously, pouring out their hearts onto the page. Others, like her, hesitated, their pencils hovering. Liesel was writing with a stiff, angry posture, her letters small and sharp. Hannah wondered what narrative she was constructing, what version of their experience she was sending home. In the end, Hannah chose the safety of the mundane. "My dearest mother," she began, "I hope this letter finds you well and safe. The weather here is turning cold. Winter is coming. My health is good. I am working. The work is hard, but I am strong. Please do not worry for me. Tell father I am thinking of him. She filled the page with these simple, neutral sentences, each one a carefully constructed shield. It was a letter that said everything and nothing, a ghost of a message. It confirmed she was alive, but offered no real information, no emotional truth. The most honest thing she could say was what she left unsaid. The letters were collected in a wooden box. Later that week, from the laundry building, Hannah saw Captain Miller sitting at a desk in his small office, the box of letters beside him. Through the window, she watched as he worked his way through the pile. He read each letter slowly, his expression unchanging. After reading each one, he picked up a small rubber stamp, pressed it onto an ink pad, and then firmly onto the bottom of the page. It was not a violent, slashing mark of red ink, as she might have imagined a censor's stamp to be. It was a neat, black, rectangular box of text, an official mark of passage. It was another administrative act, as impersonal as signing a requisition for supplies. One day, while delivering a stack of cleaned uniforms to the administration building, she saw something else. The door to the records room was ajar, and inside, a clerk was working at a tall desk. Propped open on the desk was an enormous, leather-bound ledger. As Hannah passed, she caught a glimpse of the pages. They were filled with names, written in neat, cursive script. Next to each name was a series of numbers and codes. She saw her own name, Hannah Vogel, and next to it, her prisoner number, 734. The sight of the ledger was strangely calming. It was the ultimate expression of the camp's logic. She was not a hated enemy, a subhuman creature to be tormented. She was an entry in a book. Her existence had been recorded, catalogued, and filed. She was a logistical problem to be managed with ink and paper, her fate determined not by passion or hatred, but by rules and regulations written on distant shores. The cool, detached bureaucracy of it all was the most profound weapon the Americans possessed. It disarmed the very foundations of the war's ideology. Hatred required a devil, a monster to be feared and destroyed. But how could you maintain hatred for a ledger? How could you fight against a rubber stamp and a neatly written list of names? By lamplight, in the quiet of his office, the captain wasn't battling an evil empire. He was balancing his books. The truth of her situation, Hannah realized, was not to be found in a political speech, but in the quiet, methodical scratch of a pen on paper. The winter deepened, burying the camp in a thick blanket of snow. The world beyond the wire became a uniform, brilliant white, the sharp angles of the barracks and watchtowers softened by drifts. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence, but the routine held fast. Inside the laundry, however, the cold was kept at bay by the immense heat of the boilers that powered the washing machines. The air was always thick with steam, a humid, tropical pocket in the heart of the frozen landscape. It was here, in this world of heat and hissing pipes, that the most significant breach in the wall between captor and captive occurred. It happened on a Tuesday, the coldest day of the year. One of the main steam valves on the largest boiler, a complex mass of aging iron and brass, began to fail. A jet of scalding steam shot out from a corroded joint, hissing with a furious, dangerous intensity. The room filled with a blinding white cloud in seconds, the roar of the escaping steam deafening. The women cried out in alarm and scrambled back, away from the boiler. An American guard, a young private barely out of his teens, panicked and fumbled for the main shutoff, but it was on the other side of the scalding jet. Sergeant Davis came running, wrench in hand. He sized up the situation instantly, his face grim. The escaping steam was not just a danger to the women. It threatened to disable the entire laundry, the beating heart of the camp's hygiene and order. He swore under his breath and tried to approach the boiler, shielding his face with his arm, but the heat was too intense. He backed away, frustration and worry etched on his face. He yelled at the young private to run to the maintenance shed for help, but it would take too long. Hannah watched from a safe distance. Before the war, she had worked for 2 years in a textile factory, a place filled with similar machinery. She had watched the mechanics, fascinated by the logic of the interconnected pipes and valves. She recognized this boiler's design. She knew its weaknesses. She saw what Davis, in his haste, was missing. There was a secondary pressure release valve near the floor, a smaller will designed to bleed off pressure from the system before a catastrophic failure. If he could close that first, it would reduce the force of the main leak enough for him to get to the primary shutoff. Without thinking, without weighing the consequences of speaking out of turn, she stepped forward. She pointed urgently toward the floor, at the small, grime-covered wheel near the base of the machine. Das Ventil, she shouted over the roar. Zuerst das. The valve. That one first. Davis shot her a look of pure, irritated suspicion. Why would he listen to a prisoner? But the situation was growing more desperate, the hissing louder, the room's temperature soaring. He looked from her insistent, pointing finger to the valve she indicated. He was a practical man, and the logic of it must have registered. He hesitated for only a second more. Then, with a grunt, he dropped to his knees and threw his weight against the small wheel. It was stiff with rust and disuse. He strained, his face red, the muscles in his neck cording. Hannah moved closer, gesturing with her hands, a turning motion, then pointing to the main leak. She was trying to communicate the cause and effect, the mechanical logic of it. He understood. With a final, desperate heave, the valve gave way, turning with a loud, protesting squeal. The effect was instantaneous. The violent roar of the main leak diminished to a loud, manageable hiss. The jet of steam became a plume. It was still dangerous, but it was no longer an uncontrollable force. Davis scrambled to his feet, grabbed his large wrench, and was able to get close enough to the primary shutoff. He fit the wrench around the large nut and put all his strength into it. With a groan of tortured metal, the main valve closed. The hissing stopped. Silence descended upon the laundry, thick and sudden. The only sound was the dripping of condensation from the ceiling. The room was still choked with steam, but it was no longer being fed by the broken pipe. Through the swirling white mist, Hannah saw Sergeant Davis standing by the boiler, breathing heavily, his wrench hanging from his hand. He looked at the silenced valve, then he looked across the room at her. Their eyes met through the thinning steam. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. He was no longer Sergeant Davis, the guard, and she was no longer prisoner 734. They were two people who understood how a machine worked, who had solved a problem together. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. That would have been a step too far, a violation of the unwritten rules that governed their existence. But he gave her a nod. It was a short, sharp, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a nod of respect. Then he turned, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, and began calmly inspecting the damage. The human bridge had been built and crossed in a single silent gesture. The long, hard winter finally broke. Patches of brown earth appeared in the snow-dusted yard, and the sharp, clean scent of thawing soil began to replace the sterile cold. With the arrival of spring came news from the outside world, trickling in through the guards' conversations and the occasional censored newspaper article pinned to the mess hall bulletin board. The war in Europe was ending. The cities of their homeland were in ruins, their armies in full retreat. The news was met not with grief or anger, but with a kind of numb, exhausted silence. The war had been an abstract concept for so long, a distant drumbeat. Now, its end was just another administrative fact, another change in the conditions of their confinement. One morning in early May, a week after the final surrender was announced, the women were ordered to assemble in the yard. Captain Miller stood before them, a sheaf of papers in his hand. The camp was being decommissioned, he announced through his translator. The process of repatriation would begin immediately. A wave of murmuring swept through the assembled women, a complex sound of relief, anxiety, and profound uncertainty. Home. What did that word even mean anymore? What was left of the world they had been taken from? The process of departure was the mirror image of their arrival, a meticulous unwinding of the camp's routines. They were called one by one into the administration building. They stood before the same desk where Captain Miller had once censored their letters. The large leather ledger was open. He found their name, drew a neat line through it with a ruler and a red pen, and had them sign a repatriation form. Hannah watched her own hand sign her name, the letters unfamiliar after so many months of being a number. It was just another piece of paperwork, the final entry in the book. From there, they went to the supply building to turn in their camp-issued clothing, the gray dresses, the heavy wool coats that had seen them through the winter. In exchange, they were given back their own clothes, which had been cleaned, pressed, and stored in neat, labeled bundles. Hannah unfolded her old Funk-Aaron uniform. It felt strange and foreign, a costume from another life. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, a ghost of the person she had been. The final stop was the infirmary, for a last medical checkup with Nurse Eleanor. The nurse was as brisk and professional as ever, checking their weight, listening to their chests, and updating their records. When she was finished with Hannah, she looked at her for a moment, a flicker of something other than professional detachment in her pale blue eyes. "Good luck," she said in her slow, careful German. It was the first time she had offered anything resembling a personal sentiment. Hannah simply nodded, unsure how to respond. The next morning, the same canvas-top trucks that had brought them to Camp Swiftwater were waiting in the yard. The women were lined up, their meager personal belongings in small bundles. They looked different now, dressed in their old, mismatched uniforms and civilian clothes. They were no longer a cohesive, anonymous unit, but a collection of individuals, their former identities reclaimed, however ill-fitting they now felt. Liesel stood stiffly, her face pale, her expression a confused mixture of triumphant defiance and deep-seated fear of the future. Marta looked simply tired, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her impending freedom were heavier than the burden of her captivity. Sergeant Davis stood by the open gate, overseeing the loading of the trucks. He looked the same as he always had, his face impassive, his posture rigid. But as Hannah's group filed past him to climb into the truck, his eyes met hers. There were no words. There was no handshake, no smile. But he gave her the nod again. The same short, sharp, economical gesture he had given her in the steam-filled laundry room. It was a farewell, a final acknowledgement of the strange, shared space they had occupied. It was enough. Hannah climbed into the back of the truck and found a place on the hard wooden bench. The canvas flap was secured, and once again, they were plunged into a familiar, rumbling dimness. The engine turned over, and with a lurch, the truck began to move. The truck pulled out of the main gate and onto the road, gathering speed. Hannah made her way to the back and pulled aside the edge of the canvas flap to look out. She wanted one last look at the place that had been her entire world for the better part of a year. She expected to feel a surge of relief, of joyous release. Instead, she felt a profound and unsettling quietness, a hollow space where a powerful emotion should have been. The camp was already receding, the barracks shrinking, the wire fence becoming just a thin, gray line against the greening landscape. It was losing its reality, becoming a memory even as she watched it disappear. She did not focus on the watchtowers, symbols of their imprisonment, nor on the gate that had locked them away from the world. Her eyes were drawn, instead, to the laundry building. It stood unassuming and functional, a simple wooden structure like all the others. But from a metal vent in its pitched roof, a thick plume of white steam was rising into the cool, clear morning air. The sun, just clearing the tops of the distant hills, caught the plume and transformed it. It was no longer just steam. It was a pillar of pure, brilliant light, a solid-seeming column against the deep blue of the sky. She watched it, mesmerized. It was the same steam that had filled the shower room on their first day, a cleansing, anonymous fog that had offered a moment of respite. It was the steam that had filled the mess hall, rising from the pots of stew that had nourished them and quietly dismantled the lies they had been told. It was the steam that had roared from the broken boiler, the crisis that had created an unspoken, momentary bridge of shared competence between her and the sergeant. It was the breath of the camp, the visible evidence of the work, the heat, the order that had governed their lives. As the truck moved further away, the plume of steam continued to rise, unwavering. It was constant, clean, and purposeful. It was a symbol not of cruelty or of kindness, not of victory or defeat. It represented something far more complex and paradoxical. A period of their lives that had been both a confinement and a strange sort of sanctuary. It was the quiet, industrious, and utterly impersonal system that had held them, fed them, and ultimately released them. The steam rose, caught the light, and then, at the top of its ascent, it began to thin, to fray at the edges, dissolving invisibly into the vast, indifferent air. Hannah kept watching until the truck rounded a bend in the road, and the white plume, the last visible piece of Camp Swiftwater, vanished from sight.